The first thing I wanted to tell you guys is about my, one second. Wait. It's about my favorite man, okay? But my favorite buddy. Our good friend right here. Mr. Mike Pence. So, Mr. Pence here, okay? I remember telling you all that Mike Pence had a chance, a legitimate chance, of getting the Republican nomination. This man right here, of getting the Republican nomination in 2024. And you guys all laughed at me. Like legit, like a lot of you laughed at me. Now, I brought up his polling data, which actually looks pretty good right now. I brought up the fact that the Republican base is largely evangelical, and he is still looked upon very positively by them. That moderates view him less negatively than someone like Trump, and he'd be able to pull from, even though he's in a lot of ways actually more radical than Trump when it comes to a lot more evangelical and religious standpoints. And not to mention, he has deep connections within the Republican Party establishment through a life of service to power. And I do believe somebody once classified him as basically a lifelong servant to power. And that's what this little cutie patootie has done his entire political career, is be a servant to power. If you study any of his political career, I'll just let him just kind of hang out here. Oh, well, he collapsed. Anyway. If you'll research Mike Pence's political career for any period of time, you should come to a similar conclusion that he has worked as a lifelong servant to power in pursuance of gaining more power. And he's willing to really suck up to the most despicable people on the planet in order to do that, and go pretty low in order to garner more power. That's true of his congressional runs. That's true of his times in state politics. That's true of any of his times working for other politicians. And that's true of his time in the office of vice president. Now, all that aside, all of the polling data and everything else aside, in my personal opinion that he still has a decent chance of becoming Republican nominee, he just had an interview on Sean Hannity's program. Sean Hannity is one of the staff left at Fox News that I think has yet to be accused of sexual harassment. So congrats to him on that one, on being the one in a million. But Mike Pence went on Sean Hannity's show and started talking about Donald Trump and January 6th. And if you guys remember the narratives created after the fact by the media and a lot of people talking about January 6th, Mike Pence was somebody, unless you were a hardcore like culter or a QAnon type or a Trump cultist, was somebody who came out of January 6th relatively squeaky clean. He did not try to overthrow the government. He did not try to go by the coup instructions that Trump's lawyer wrote up. True story, by the way. Look into it. It's on my YouTube channel if you want to see the story behind that. He didn't try to do that, and he generally did what his office was meant to do, and he passed power on. And that's the general narrative around Mike Pence. But Mike Pence is now trying to change the narrative about around January 6th. Let's read a little bit of the excerpts from this interview. Mike Pence showed Monday night that he is willing to say almost anything to get back in Donald Trump's good graces. Appearing on Sean Hannity's show on Fox News, the former vice president was asked about his relationship with the 45th president, particularly in light of his refusal to overturn the 2020 election, as Trump had suggested on January 6th. Here's his answer. Look, you can't spend almost 5 years in a political foxhole without developing a strong relationship. And you know, January 6th was a tragic day in the history of our Capitol building. But thanks to the efforts of the Capitol Hill Police, federal officials, the Capitol was secured. We finished our work, and the president and I sat down a few days later and talked through all of it. I do want to note that I feel that maybe most of this should have been talked through during or beforehand, not after the fact, once the damage was already done, but whatever. Let's continue. I can tell you that we parted amicably at the end of the administration, and we've talked a number of times since we both left office. But I believe that our entire focus today should be on the future. I've campaigned a couple of times for Glenn Youngkin, who will be a great governor in the state of Virginia. God, please no. I've been traveling all across this country, helping our team, running for the House and the Senate, and I've been helping governors candidates around America. Now, this is the important part. So I know the media wants to distract from the Biden administration's failed agenda by focusing on one day in January. They want to use that one day to try to demean the character and intentions of 74 million Americans who believe we could be strong again and prosperous again and supported our administration in 2016 and 2020. So, let's break this down. This interview starts with Trump talking about how he stood in a political foxhole, with Pence saying he stood in a political foxhole with Trump, and they worked together and built a strong relationship. He says that January 6th was bad, but he wants to just really hit home the fact that him and the president, they're good, they're chill. When they parted ways, they were chill. They talked about it. They talked multiple times since then. And hey, look at Pence. He's fighting really hard to make sure that Republicans are elected in the House, the governorship of Virginia, and all across the country. And how friendly he still is with Donald Trump. So when I said that Pence still has a decent chance of becoming president in 2024, or at least being vice president for Trump going into 2024 if Trump decides to run again, this is part of the reason why. Not only is it because Mike Pence has a long history of sucking up to people, but he's continuing that long history today. Even if there was some sparring over the events of January 6th, to Pence, he signifies in this interview, that's all in the past. Him and Trump are still friends. They're still buddies. Hey, look, he's still doing the dirty work for the Republicans and getting Republicans elected all across the country. And you combine the fact that he's sucking back up to Trump, which Trump might make note of. And I am personally going to add that to my list of reasons why I think we cannot go 1, 2, 3. Pence is out. He's out of the run for president. He's out of the run for higher office. We don't need to think about that man anymore. Man is polling well. Man has an evangelical base. He has deep connections within the Republican Party. Ties to the Trump administration, so a history of experience in the executive branch as being vice president. And willing to suck back up to Trump after being his basically a second-hand man for the entirety of the administration. Remember, Pence jumped on the Trump train when Trump was at his lowest points politically. He needed somebody to polish up his image. Now, there are reports talking about how Pence considered and even talked about openly with other Republican officials during the run for president, taking Trump out of the running and replacing him with Pence, but he stayed in line and did that work. So I just want to emphasize that it seems that Pence is doing the legwork to put him in a position to run for president with Trump's endorsement, or with at least amicable ties to Trump, so maybe Trump will stay out of it. Again, I want to just say that we cannot count Trump out of it. Pence out of it. I really think he still has a shot. But moving that to the side, this part right here. This is him downplaying what happened on January 6th. Let me just say the things that occurred around January 6th. Multiple people were found to be bringing firearms to the Capitol and were arrested for firearms charges. Bombs were planted outside of the RNC and DNC. Over 150 cops were injured, and I believe 4 of which ended up killing themselves after the fallout. We all know about Brian Sicknick. People were trampled to death. Ashley Babbitt lost her life after she tried to barge past more and more barriers inside the Capitol building. People tore down the barriers that police put up to get inside the Capitol. The press were assaulted and their camera equipment was smashed up. People were going into that Capitol building in order to stop the certification of the votes. And you want to know what? It wasn't stopped, but it was delayed. And while this was going on, Trump's lawyer was writing up instructions for a coup. Again, if you think I'm being hyperbolic, just check my video on it. Or just look up the instructions. They're readily available on the internet, even if daytime television isn't covering it. I saw many of this with my own eyes. Again, I was there. Not as a rioter, but as a dumbass counter-protester in a Biden hoodie. Not my smartest move. The long delay it took for a response to get people on the ground to stop what was going on is something that everybody agrees was terrible. Now, where the blame lies is debated, and I don't want to get back into that debate, but I just want people to know that while much of this was going on, the commander-in-chief was sitting on the couch just watching Fox News cover the events like a spectator and tweeting out while people were storming the Capitol how Pence had failed them. This was all while Pence was directly being pressured to overturn American democracy, with instructions written out by Trump's personal lawyers on how to commit a coup. That was the political environment. That was the Capitol insurrection, and yes, I will use that word. And what Pence has to say about that is, well, I know the media wants to distract from Biden by focusing on one day in January. One day in January. It's all used to demean the character and intentions of the 74 million Americans who believe it could be strong again. One day in January. I mean, you could classify that many historical events as one day in a month, right? You could call the Boston bombing just one day in a month. But that one day irrevocably changed how we all view American democracy and the lives of many police officers who, during the fallout of that and during the day's events, caused them to lose their lives. That one day in January certainly had an impact on the life of, say, Ashley Babbitt. Or the other 150 officers who were injured. By the way, many of those officers still haven't returned to service due to the injuries they sustained. There have been reports of officers who have turned in their firearms because they're worried that they might use it to end their own lives, like many of their colleagues have. There's a reason why the Capitol Police were so prepared on September 18th. Another protest that I went to and interviewed people, again, you can find that on my channel as well, is because they didn't want a repeat of January 6th, and they were worried about what would happen. And you talk about one day in January, for the people who live in DC or in the DMV, them seeing gates up in their community, blocking off parts of their community from them to access it, that they have to now walk around that and see their reminder as they walk around their communities. That one day also had an impact. But he's saying that the Democrats are concentrating on this because they hate Trump, etc., etc. Of course, that events could be used when one side of the political spectrum messes up, the other side of the political spectrum will use it against them. That happens all the time. If Biden ever messes something up in his speech, you're going to see a compilation of that for the next week. If he just fumbles his words. This happens all the time. But let's not downplay exactly what happened on that day. And it's strange because, I mean, this was going to happen eventually, right? I mean, Pence was one of the few Republicans that came out of January 6th that the media generally covered favorably due to his actions on the 6th, which we all gave him a round of applause for literally not overthrowing the United States government, even though that is quite literally the bare minimum. Whatever, though. He didn't do that. But, as I have said before, Mike Pence, above all else, is a servant to power. And Trump still has a deep hold on the Republican Party. There's a reason why Miss Cheney lost her second most powerful position in the House. And that's because she would not pretend that the election was stolen in 2020. That is where Trump's power is manifesting right now in the Republican Party. And Pence, being a servant of power who wants more power, was inevitably going to do something like this. And so moving forward, can we stop pretending that Mike Pence was a January 6th hero who bucked his commander-in-chief to stand with the Republic? Because now he's downplaying the event that did happen, where we're all trying to give him applause for. And not to mention, he's going to say it's one day in January and attack the left for politicizing it. But then he politicizes it anyway and says they want to use that one day to try and demean the character and attention to 74 million Americans who believe we can be strong again and prosperous again. No, that's not what people are angry about. People are angry about the hundreds upon hundreds of people who stormed the Capitol and tried to tear down our democracy, and those who incited that storming of the Capitol. We still haven't gotten an answer as to why Mo Brooks had body armor on January 6th. We still haven't gotten that answer. That's something I'm very curious to hear about. Anyway, I wanted to cover this section of the interview. Stop pretending Mike Pence is a hero. He's a servant to power. This is just another example of him turning in his values in order to continue to be a servant to power. Now, that's enough of that section.